All right, we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Wild and Precious Optimal Living Show. I am your host, Dr. Sam McDonald, with my co-host,
Dr. Lynn.
And thank you all so much for joining us today. Man, we've got just a lightning show today. I am super excited about this, and I've been excited about this for the past couple months for our guest today, guys, because this one, let me tell you, it is going to be a barn burner, as they say in the South. So let me go ahead and read the intro here. Dr. Robert Melillo is one of the world's most sought after and respected experts in developmental functional neurology, brain imbalances, hemispheric integration, and the diagnosis and correction of most neurobehavioral disorders and learning disabilities. In 2006, he created Brain Balance Achievement Centers, which has approximately 150 centers and has helped tens of thousands of families. He is a prolific author, brain researcher, and has published one major textbook titled Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood, An Evolutionary Perspective. In addition, Dr. Melillo has also written 5 best-selling books, including his best-known, Disconnected Kids, which has now been translated into 8 languages.
And I want to be able to add, too, this year, neither Dr. Sam and I had any idea of really how things would fall into place. In 2020, what has really truly kept us grounded is the extra programs that Dr. Melillo offers, which is personal and professional development. So these last number of months since COVID really shook our country, we started coaching. Actually, we were looking for some guidance, and he's been a major inspiration for us and what we do in the office, both clinically and then also personally too, as a family and a couple. So really grateful to have Dr. Melillo on the show because it's so meaningful. He's been our teacher this year, so we're really grateful to have him with us today.
So Dr. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That was a great introduction, but believe me, the pleasure of working with you guys and seeing your beautiful family, and it's been really such a pleasure. So I'm really excited to be here with you guys because I feel so connected with you. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Well, the foundation and focus of the show is thriving in stress, with especially focusing on kiddos and even adults with ADHD, OCD, and anxiety. And boy, we've got a lot to talk about with that. I mean, this year has been stressful for everybody, and the adults and the kids that struggle with these particular conditions, I mean, they've been dealing with this for a lot longer than 2020. So really would love to dive in, Dr. Rob. Let's just lay the foundation. So we've talked a lot about your work on the show with several other practitioners talking about the Melillo method. And really, can you give us just the foundation? What is functional disconnection?
Well, it's a great question. It's actually a really big question, right? But when you look at the research, as I have really been immersed in it, because I'm a researcher as well as a clinician. Over the past 30 years, really, all of the research in neurology, neuroscience, psychology has revolved around a concept called functional connectivity. And essentially what that means is that, what we've come to realize is that most issues that involve the brain are not, actual anatomical pathologies. There's no damage, there's no injury, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance, and they're not genetic. So what are they? They're basically a wiring issue and a communication issue where different networks are not communicating with one another, they're not talking to one another. And it's not just physical connectivity, but it has to do with the way they communicate on different frequency bands and things of that nature. And so that happens, and the brain develops in a way that as the brain is developing and maturing, we get more connectivity in the brain. We get more physical connectivity, we form more synapses and connections, but we also become more functionally connected. And that is something that helps to integrate all the different areas of our brain, and especially the 2 hemispheres of the brain, which really are very separate from one another. And so what we see is that in that process of development and growth, or even later on in life as a result of an injury or trauma, some of these networks either don't connect with each other or become disconnected with one another. And again, there's not any injury or any one spot in the brain that we can point to. It's just areas of the brain are not able to communicate with one another. And this is known as a functional disconnection, especially when we see it between the two hemispheres, which is the most common type of functional disconnection.
Okay. All right. And taking a step back now, looking at how brains and how nervous systems develop, and even in your bio we talked about, this developmental functional neurology. So can you walk us through how does this stuff come about? Does the nervous system develop ultimately for us to be a fully functioning adult?
Yeah, and this is really important because, what it really revolves around is that people talk, and, when I first started looking at this as a clinician, it was really personal to me because I had some issues with my own son, and the concern of ADHD and all of these things. And then as I started getting involved with it, there's all these different labels, like you mentioned, OCD and ADHD and Tourette's and autism. And, for me, I already had a very strong background in neurology. I was a postgraduate professor of clinical neurology, and I knew a lot about the brain, but I didn't know a lot about these childhood types of issues because I dealt mostly with them in adults at this point. And the question that I really wanted to know from the beginning is, what is ADHD? What is OCD? What is autism? What is actually happening in the brain? I mean, if you understand that the brain is the seat of behavior, then abnormal behavior of any kind must have something to do with the brain. But how does the brain become the brain? How does it, why do we have brains to begin with? This is one of the things that led me to write my first book, Evolutionary Perspective, so that understanding, what was the first brain that ever emerged on the planet and why did it emerge? So, what we see is that the idea of what is the core issue and how does it happen. So again, when I became aware of the idea of functional disconnection, that areas or networks weren't communicating with one another, and that especially between the two hemispheres, again, my question was why? Why does that happen? Is there damage or is there injury? And so it goes back to saying, how does the brain develop, and how do the right and the left brain develop, and how do the right and the left brain develop and become different? Because one of the things that we know that's very true is that both sides of the brain are what we call asymmetric or lateralized, or they operate differently, right? More than just, the right side of the brain may control certain aspects of movement on the left side or vice versa, but, speech is on the left side and nonverbal communication on the right side. But it's really, very much more complex than that, where literally the right and the left brain, even though they start out pretty similar, they end up very, very different, and this is an advantage. But how does that happen? And what we see is abnormal lateralization is really often associated with all of these developmental issues. So one of the things that I learned early on was that there was a difference in the timing of the way the right and the left brain develop. And so the right brain develops first in the womb and for the first 3 years, so that even though both sides of the brain are growing, all of this sensory information and experiences that are coming in and really developing and growing the brain from the bottom up are really impacting the right brain more, and the right brain is reacting more quickly. Not that the left brain isn't reacting, but the right brain becomes slightly advantaged in certain things. And then after 3 years, the left brain kicks in, and then the left brain develops. And then during those years, the left brain gains an advantage. And once there is a slight advantage in either side of the brain, they become better at those things and they do them more, and then they become more and more and more specialized as we mature and as we grow. And that is the way it's normally supposed to happen. But what happens is that something can go awry in the developmental growth, where one side of the brain may kick in too early, or one side slows down and the other side comes in too aggressively, or instead of the right side developing first, the left side develops first. So different things can go awry that can throw this off, and that is most commonly the basis of a functional disconnection. And we know that almost all adult mental health issues start in childhood and in the womb. So whatever happens in those first 6 years really impacts us for the rest of our lives, And even though we can correct it at any stage, most people don't know that, and they have no idea how to do that, so that most people will end up suffering for the rest of their lives. And even things like schizophrenia that may not show up till they're in their 20s, we know that we can kind of identify some of these kids from their siblings early on.
Mhm. I think that that's been profound in what we're doing too personally. I mean, as parents of a 3-year-old, I feel like when we had Rivers the first few years, we were really just trying to figure out how to even just be parents, and what a big gift it has been to be able to apply what you just talked about in seeing how our son's growing up as well too. And we don't think about it, but even just how he's moving in terms of those gross motor skills, and then you're learning how the right brain's really involved in just the milestone steps about just being tummy time, all the way to crawling, to sitting and standing, all those different factors and the rhythm behind it. It's something, unfortunately, has been missed in our society, and pediatricians even. I feel like, unfortunately, it's not in their paradigm, so it's not discussed, and the rhythm and timing of all this is so necessary and often missed. And then as we develop those left brain fine motor skills, when the left brain starts to kick in, and I feel like what you're saying really is true in a sense. We don't think about our movements too, and behind all this. Do you find that as kiddos or children now who are more virtual schooling or at home, do you find that that's contributing to some of the disconnect that maybe they're missing out on with development, and just wanting just that question on that?
Yeah, the idea that our traditional medicine and psychology is so biased towards biochemistry and towards infectious disease and towards looking at, cognitive behavior. And they don't understand at all, that, what is the foundation of behavior? Where does it come from? And again, one of the things I looked at first is, why did we develop brains on this planet? And it turns out that when a living thing moved under its own power, it needed a brain. So brains develop based on movement. That's why they evolved to begin with. And we see in childhood, it's kind of like mini evolution. And what we see is that a child needs to move and interact with the world to really initiate everything. One of the best analogies, I think, is that we're born with this kind of basic software operating system. Like, let's say you got a new computer and it has a basic operating system in it so that it can just kind of run, right? But it doesn't mean anything until you input data to it, until you input it or start using it. Well, that's the way we have this brain that can generate patterns so that we could walk and move and talk and understand certain things. But it doesn't mean anything until we actually calibrate it to the world, until we interact with the world. We have to actually move. We have to interact and experience, and then it comes back and it matches this pattern with the world. And then, this is when it makes sense. This is how we develop. So in the beginning, we're born with these basic primitive reflexes that allow us to move when we don't really have a brain yet. And it allows us to engage our senses and actively sense the world and experience the world and calibrate the brain. And it allows the baby to roll over and crawl on their belly and crawl on all fours and be able to feed themselves and protect themselves, and eventually leads to them walking. And then at 1 year after they walk and they start talking, this basic operating system needs to be kind of deleted and it needs to be upgraded, right? And then this needs to happen basically kind of each year until we get to an adult brain. And what we see is that a lot of problems start because that basic software system isn't deleted, that these reflexes don't go away after 1 year like they're supposed to. They're supposed to disappear and be replaced by more complex movement. And this doesn't happen. So what we see is that not only does it affect the movement, where a baby may not crawl appropriately or scoot on their butt, or they don't crawl at all, or they walk too early, or they walk too late, and then they talk late, and then they think late, and then they have problems with reading, and then they may have problems with ADHD and behavior, and later on when they're 30 or 40, they may have really severe mental health issues. And pediatrician doesn't follow people for that point, so they don't really realize this. They don't. It's like reading the beginning of the book and never really seeing how the book ends up, right? You don't know, and that's so pediatricians, they'll see. There's a basic blueprint that we've always known about how the brain is supposed to develop. And when I had one mom tell me, why do they give us these lists of milestones that if you don't hit the milestones, you go and tell the pediatrician that, and they say, well, it doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter, why do they give them to us to begin with? And it's because they don't know what to do about it. So it does matter, and it matters a lot. And if you know what to do about it and you know how to intervene when a child isn't crawling appropriately, you can change the course of the whole child's development at that point. And motor activity is really critical to it, and it's foundational to actual cognitive abilities, meaning cognitive abilities are literally built on top of motor development. Our prefrontal cortex, which we don't have yet when we're born, which is where the seat of our cognition and all of our behavior, it literally grows out of our motor cortex. So if we're not moving properly, that is the most important thing, and then that can affect brain, and then that can affect our biochemical system and lead us prone to things like infections, and ultimately affects our cognitive development. And so what we see is that we're trying to deal with this issue, at the wrong stage. We're trying to deal with a metabolic problem or an infectious problem or a cognitive problem instead of really looking at the core root problem, which is really what my work is all about and what you guys are doing in your center.
Yeah. And so is it ever too late to identify these? Obviously, the nervous system is not upgrading to the second level of operation, right? And we detect these primitive reflexes, let's say later on in childhood. Let's say it's not addressed, and you briefly touched upon what that looks like for an adult in terms of mental health or more vulnerable to disease. What does that look? Is that too late to address then, as for a child or an adult, or where does that come in terms of getting support?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, as you know, because you're taking my courses when I teach doctors and therapists around the world, most of the people I work with don't just work with children. They work with adults, they work with teenagers. And it's important to understand that, functional developmental neurology isn't just about kids. But what we do know is that if your brain if these reflexes don't go away, or if something else affects the development of the brain early, it won't self-correct. If anything, you develop this functional imbalance between networks, and what happens is the strong areas tend to dominate over, and the weaker areas tend to get weak in time. So we know that, kids with ADHD don't outgrow it, or kids with learning disabilities don't outgrow it or get better, they get worse over time. And what happens is that when they're adults, they, usually they find ways to compensate. And what I also say is that almost all the kids that I work with and the adults, the reason why they develop this imbalance between their hemispheres and between networks is because they're actually gifted in certain areas and certain networks, right? They have very strong traits. And, when we say someone's gifted or someone's talented or someone's intelligent, what does that mean? What does it actually mean? Why is someone better at sports, or actually better at art, or, better at math? What it turns out is that there's, different areas of our brain that regulate all those functions, that regulate all those abilities. And they are, networks or sub-networks. And the more connected they are, the better they communicate with one another, the stronger they are, the better we are at that skill. So that intelligence or art ability can really be traced to neurological functions in the brain and advances. And what can happen often is that when we're really good in one area of one side of the brain, and the same area on the other side of the brain that may do something different may not be as good. But we have this trait that's really strong, and it gives us this ability. And so we have, these people that are born naturally gifted, where they're much more strongly left brain dominant, and they have these math skills, or they have these intellect skills, or on the right side, they may have more, like creative writing skills or music or something like that, art. And because that area is so strong naturally, if the other side of the brain doesn't keep up with it, it's more likely to develop this maturational imbalance. And once that one side gains too much advantage, it doesn't let go of it. And this is really the root problem. So, these people really learn how to compensate because they do have these unusual gifts and strengths. And that also makes it hard to believe. How can this person have a problem in their brain? They're a genius in certain things. I remember I lectured at MIT a few years ago to their artificial intelligence department. And, these kids are all geniuses, right? But not one of them had even the most basic normal social skills. I mean, none. It was unbelievable. They were like 5-year-olds when it came to their, so what they have is these incredible left brain skills, but their right brain was so deficient. But this led to this genius level skill, but they were all suffering and struggling with so many other issues. And so what we want to do is be able to make the whole brain work together and be balanced. And so this idea of this imbalance is not just because of damage or because of injury, it's superimposed on really some unusual strengths. And so people that you wouldn't expect necessarily that have a problem, may, and these are things that we can change, and this may not show up until adulthood. But when we look at them, you guys have seen videos of me working with doctors and PhDs, and we check them, and they have these primitive reflexes still there, full blown, like when they're born. Yeah. And we can get rid of them. And when we do, we can instantly get rid of anxiety that they've had their whole life, or digestive problems, or other types of issues that they've had by, creating this better balance.
Yeah, this is like a pulp culture reference to a recent Netflix release called The Queen's Gambit. You ever heard of that one?
Yes, absolutely. My wife's a big chess player, and we love that movie. And through the whole thing, I'm looking at it going, okay, this girl definitely is a left-brain dominant.
Yes, I was watching through the whole series. It's a mini-series, great series, and seriously, it's like a different perspective of after going through your studies of like what we could probably work with. Left brain dominant, absolutely. So.
Yeah, I mean, between seeing stuff like that, I mean, gosh, I think every time I turn on the TV, I see somebody with facial asymmetry, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere.
I mean, it's crazy. Now you can't not see it, right? Yeah. I warn people. Exactly. You never saw it before, and now, unfortunately, you're never going to unsee it. And now when you look at it, you're like, ooh.
Whoa. Yeah.
Now you go back to your friends and your family, and you see their facial asymmetry, and you go, oh, that's why I've had this problem with you.
Well, Sam actually asked his parents to bring his second grade school picture so he could look at his features.
Yeah, I'm curious to see, because I mean, this is part, a big impact in like thinking about my past. I'm like, well, this is very personal to me. I had a teacher tell me that I should be on medication for ADHD, and it's just like, well, I wonder what was there at the time and potentially if there is anything. But I'm curious, because you touched on the developmental piece a lot and how functional disconnection can happen. But we've had parents come in that tell us, no, my kid, walked right on, or they crawled for 6 months, they walked right on time, they hit all their milestones, everything was right in order, but yet they're still struggling with, ADHD, OCD, whatever the label is. So what are other ways that functional disconnection can come about?
Yeah, well, first of all, again, what they consider norms now are really not norms. So, children should walk at one year, and they should start to speak at least 5 words at 1 year. And for me, if it's like 11 to 13 months, if they don't do it within that kind of 2 to 3 month range, they're late, or they're delayed, or it's abnormal. So, but, the norms are like, they'll tell them, up to 16 months is normal, now 18 months. Now some people are saying up to 2 years is normal. And now some people are actually saying that, there's a psychologist that wrote a paper saying, that 50% of kids now don't crawl in a normal way. So that therefore, normal crawling is not normal anymore.
Wow.
That the other ways of crawling are also considered normal, and they don't want to stigmatize the kids, and they don't want to make the parents feel bad. And to me, what they're doing is they're normalizing pathology. So I think most parents, you want to know what's optimal for your kids, not what's typical, right? Yeah. So just because what we see is that, 50% of kids don't crawl normally. What we also see, again, if you look and you expand that out, is we have this explosive epidemic of autism and ADHD and OCD and all of these things. And so there's a correlation there that, yeah, more kids are not crawling normally and more kids end up having issues, and we end up more adults having problems later on in life because we're not dealing with it. So the first thing I would say is, when somebody says that, no, my kid developed perfectly normally, I say, well, what does that mean? I mean, I want to know exactly, when did they crawl? When did they walk? Did they crawl in the right way? And when you go back and really dissect it, you're very rarely going to find someone that had a completely normal development within that first year. But, I mean, and again, sometimes it doesn't manifest motorically. It might manifest that they had eczema at 3 months when dairy was introduced, or they had chronic digestive problems, or, there may be some other issues. And then also, when did they speak and how did they speak? Did they need to go to speech therapy when they were younger? And even though most parents consider that, well, it's normal, they just have a little lisp or something. Or, what you can also see is, again, because these people are gifted, they may be able to compensate. So, they look like they're doing average skills, like maybe they're getting C's in school, but they really should be straight A students. So that's why, looking at the whole totality of the issue is really important. But like you said, there are other issues besides the first year. We know that, the brain is developing throughout, all the way up until, our 20s, we're developing our brain. Right. And so anything that interferes with development, trauma, a severe health illness can do things. Anything within that first 6 years that can alter or develop growth or development. If they break their leg, if they, if their parents get divorced, there's a lot of things that can impact the growth and development of the brain. That may be after the reflexes have already integrated and when things are starting to look good. So there's a lot of issues there that we can look at in the first 6 years. But and even later on in life, they may have had a perfectly normal development. I think at least 50% out there probably do have normal development. But brain injury, concussions, sports injuries, car accidents, psychological trauma, going to war, being raped, things like that can also cause this functional disconnection in the brain.
Wow. Yeah, I'd love to be able to continue to dig deeper. I just want to be able to branch off a little bit, and quick shout out to our sponsor for Shed Light Code Lasers before we forget today.
Absolutely.
And so Shed Light Code Laser is what's bringing this show, making this show possible, and we're super grateful for them. And I know that Dr. Melillo, you yourself actually use Shed Light laser as well too, the Avant laser, correct, with some of the Melillo method as well for you?
Absolutely, yes. It's an incredible tool that I use. When we start talking about how do you change these things, how do you alter them, I'm always looking for the latest, most cutting edge tools, and I think the laser, and in particular the Shed Light laser, is one of the best tools that we have to use.
Yeah, I have to agree. We use it not just at practice but also at home, and it's been a really amazing tool. And as we're learning to pull this together, I remember when I first got Shed Light, I really didn't know how to really apply it, and it's actually with you as we're learning these things in terms of how the brain's developing, how we can work with not just adults or not just children but also adults, how all that comes together. It's been really cool to be able to apply some technology to it and see quicker results and more dynamic results as well too.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like anything, any tool, obviously how well it's built and crafted is incredibly important, but like any tool, how it's used is really the most important thing. And combining an excellent product now with the most cutting edge applied neuroscience in developmental functional neurology, I mean, nothing else comes close. And like we always talk about every time on the show, the support network behind Shed Light and the company is really what sets it apart. I mean, the people that have designed it and developed it and put their heart and soul into it is really what sets it apart. So yes, thank you to our sponsor Shed Light for really bringing this show out to the public, and thank you, Dr. Rob, for being on here. So yeah, let's continue the conversation. And one thing I do want to touch on, because we've talked about the vertical integration piece, talking about the primitive reflexes and how those can be retained. I mean, we've seen them in, I think the oldest client we've seen them in is in their 70s. and has these still there, and seen them, obviously in most of the kiddos that come in as well. But the other piece I want to talk about is the balance and coordination piece, because I think that's something that's really, really important. And the analogy we use a lot in the office, if we're building our neurology house, we got to address the foundation, which is the perimeter reflexes, but then the walls are really the balance and coordination. So Doc, can you talk a little bit about what that's going to look like in kids? And again, like we touched on, most kids are going to virtual learning now. I mean, how damaging is that for their development?
Yeah. Well, one of the two things that make the human brain unique, right, is not only the way our brain is, the size of it, but the fact that we're bipedal. So standing upright and walking in a bipedal position has something to do with creating the most sophisticated brain on the planet. And so therefore, when we look at that, we know that the only main difference between us and other, let's say, non-human primates that don't stand upright is the size of our brain and the fact that they're not bipedal. But structurally, we're pretty similar. There are some subtle differences, but the main thing is our balance, is our ability to coordinate. Humans don't realize how good our balance is, because we take what we do by standing upright as, easy. And we do that because we have something called proprioception. Proprioception is the ability to really know where our body is in space and coordinate it. And most of that comes from our spine and from the muscles along the spine, as well as the other muscles. And that, to me, proprioception is the master sensation, meaning all other senses are integrated on top of proprioception. There's an interesting book I read a few years ago that talks about, proprioception and how important it is. And it goes on to say that if you took a kitten from the time it was born, and if you never allowed its paws to touch the ground, right, if you only carried it around, and of course I'm not advocating this, right, but that cat would grow up and it would effectively be blind for the rest of its life. It would not see. Now you look at it and go, but there's nothing wrong with its eyes, so why wouldn't it see? Because it has to superimpose that visual information, has to be put into context. Like we said, it has to kind of be calibrated to the system and to the world around it, otherwise it doesn't mean anything. So proprioceptive input from our body, which we first get from rolling over and then crawling on our belly and then crawling on all fours and then standing up and walk. So balance, which involves the postural muscles and the inner ear and the eyes, really those three systems are the foundation of the brain. And this is connected to an area in the back of our brain called the cerebellum, which is really what controls a lot of our balance and coordination. And so what we look at is we have these paired systems, right? We have the paired muscles of the spine. We have the inner ear system. We have the eyes. We have the cerebellum. And then this is the foundation of the paired system of our brain. And the brain is built on top of that. And so anything that affects the development of this, if we have an imbalance in our inner ear, our postural muscles, and we develop a head tilt, this develops an imbalance in our inner ear, which then imbalance in our eyes to compensate, and then this creates an imbalance in the way our brain is developing. So that is what prevents the two hemispheres from communicating with one another, because one side is more immature than the other and they can't connect. So balance is critical, and it is really the most foundational thing. And as we said, there's a lot of ways to build a house. There's really only one optimal blueprint, right? And if you deviate from that blueprint, you may build a house that works, but it's not really optimal, and if a big wind comes by or an earthquake, everything may fall down. So, that's the balance is essential for that, and an imbalance in our body usually equals an imbalance in our brain. Poor coordination of our muscles, awkwardness of coordination, is going to affect the timing and the coordination of our networks, which is really what thinking is.
So with our audience, not just adults and also kids, a lot of times we think about, I need to straighten up, I need to we think about immediate fixing up our actual posture, but what you're talking about with terms of balance and coordination, it also ties, it just reminds us to really think that there's something deeper. If we even simply maybe take a selfie, a picture of ourselves full length with our eyes closed, and just seeing really just those little distortions, you can immediately kind of see what is, you can start to ask yourself, what is some imbalance that may exist that is actually stemming from the inner ear, the eye, the vision, and the postural muscles itself, right?
I think that's important, you know, because Sam, you mentioned two things, you know,
Mhm.
facial asymmetry, and you talked about vertical integration, and the audience may not understand what we're talking about with that, right? This is something that we know about. So what we see, Lynn, is that when we have an imbalance in our body, it often shows up as imbalance in muscle tone.
Right.
And so what we often can see is in the face, we see a difference in tone. So that one eye may be bigger and one side of the mouth may droop down a little bit, or you see less of a crease on one side versus the other, or you see a head tilt or a head rotation or a body tilt. And these are differences in muscle tone, which is a reflection of the nervous system and ultimately the brain. When we talk about vertical integration and horizontal integration, what we mean is that a lot of my principles and what, you know, my program is built on in my research is that we build the brain from the bottom up, meaning it starts when we're first born, the lower part of our brainstem is active, which regulates basic things like digestion and heartbeat and breathing and these primitive reflexes and the ability to kind of swallow and suck and chew and all those things. And then, you know, when we use those things, we give feedback, and then the next layer of the brain in the brainstem develops and shuts off these reflexes and allows, you know, more complex movement and more complex reflexes. And then the next layer builds, and the next layer and next layer, until the brain kind of grows from the middle back and from the middle front, and then it comes down and regulates everything, right? So ultimately it controls, like a puppeteer, it regulates everything. I mean, our immune system, our digestive system, our heart rate, all of our muscle tone, you know, all of our sensory processing, everything, our detoxification, our blood sugar regulation, everything is controlled ultimately by the brain, but only if the brain develops appropriately. So the vertical integration is from the bottom up, and then from the top down. That's what we call vertical integration. But at the same time, we have to also integrate the right and left side of the nervous system in the brainstem and ultimately the brain. And these two things have to happen simultaneously as we develop. And so also, you know, when I'm training doctors and therapists, I train them that you have to examine people looking at that vertical integration and that horizontal integration. And one of the windows into that, and not only a window into, you know, what's happening in your face and in your muscles and in your posture, but when you see facial asymmetry, you know that your digestive system isn't working. You know that your immune system isn't working. And it can be different. So the left side of the brain activates the immune system. The right side inhibits it. So if you have, let's say, a right-sided deficit, as you may see in ADHD or OCD or Tourette's or autism, you have people with an overactive immune system, and they get eczema and asthma and food allergies and food sensitivities. And on the other hand, you get people with a left brain delay, which is things like dyslexia, learning disabilities, language issues, ultimately maybe things like bipolar disorder and PTSD. And these things are associated with a lower immune system, where they're weak immune system. They're always getting sick, or they have chronic ear infections, or they had tubes in their ears. You know, they get sick. These are the people that may be exposed to coronavirus and get sick and die, you know. So there's, you know, direct relationship there when we're talking about looking at facial asymmetry in these integration processes.
Wow, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And to me, I think one of the coolest things about the entire method that you've put together is you sit back and you take the 40,000-foot view. How does neurology develop? And you go through it step by step, and you're like, you know, this just makes sense. I mean, like explaining to people, hey, you have to have core stability first, meaning that your core, your stomach, back muscles, everything has to be strong before you can move. And so we'll take patients that come in. I mean, I just remember earlier this week having an adult patient who's got massive vertigo problems. He's been to every doctor known to man coming in, and he still has these problems. You know, and he's also got other autoimmune type issues going on. But we just go back to the very beginning and look at the process. How did the nervous system develop? Yes, he's got some of these primitive reflexes, but then we look at this, you know, core stability and balance and everything else, and it's like, man, it's, I mean, not even there. I mean, he couldn't hold up. We evaluate people in the office looking at things like planks and bridges, and he couldn't hold a plank for 25 seconds. And it's like, well, okay, we got to work on this first before we can start looking at any of this other more complex neurology. And that's something that I think every parent comes in and is really wowed by, because they said, wow, you actually examined my kid. You actually had your hands on them and you were like interacting with them, and it's just, they almost can't believe it.
Yeah, well, as you know, a lot of my work, especially, you know, I have the brain balance centers, which really work with higher functioning kids, and really don't, for the most part, they don't work with adults, and they don't work with really low functioning kids. And I've really been spending, you know, the last 5 years or so really focusing on perfecting my approach to that, meaning that, you know, give me the most difficult, the most challenging cases around the world. And I've traveled literally around the world to different countries, and, you know, seen thousands of these people, and really perfecting it. And you know, what you see is that most of these kids are never examined by anybody. They're never even touched by anybody. And you know, it's incredibly rewarding. You know, when you can get a kid that would never have spoken to speak. I mean, there's not much more rewarding than that, right?
Absolutely.
And you know, it just makes sense. It's just when you understand what the actual core problem is, when you understand that it is developmental in most cases, or even if it isn't developmental, it's still the same thing. And you know, you look at these factors. I think I told you, I actually was out in Colorado, I forget when, maybe last year, and I was seeing this guy who really was struggling, and he had a bad car accident, a bad head injury, and he had a lot of vertigo and dizziness, and you know, his eyes were all over the place and couldn't, you know, do anything. He had headaches, and he had to wear glasses all the time. And he had seen somebody who was doing eye exercises with him, and you know, because he had eye problems for sure, but it only made him throw up when he did the exercises. And then he went to see a colleague of ours who said, well, you have, you know, so many ear problems, so we need to literally spin you upside down and different things. And again, he would get off it and just throw up.
Yeah.
And so I went out there and saw the guy, and first thing I did was ask him about his development, right? Which they had never done. And it turns out that this guy grew up with severe dyslexia his whole life. And, you know, he still had dyslexia, and obviously it was worse. And he had this severe left brain delay. And then he also related to me that he was abused by his father physically his whole life because his father was an alcoholic. So now that is what we call adverse childhood experiences. So that's not only psychological, that literally affects brain development. All of these things impact brain development. And so they were doing these things, working on his inner ear or working on his eyes, and they forgot the whole basis of the system. And he still had all these primitive reflexes that he had his whole life. They'd never been gone. And no one had even looked at them. And as soon as I started addressing and getting rid of some of these reflexes and stimulating only the left side of the brain, he felt better after the first session. And it really started to heal everything, and we were able to really fix him. And whereas, you know, people say, well, your eyes are all messed up. Yeah, but, you know, is that something that is only an eye problem? Or is it an eye problem that is superimposed on an inner ear problem, that's superimposed on a postural problem, and that's superimposed on a developmental problem? And if you don't understand that, you're never going to be able to correct these issues.
Absolutely. And like we explained to people, look, if you've got a shifted foundation causing cracks in your walls, do you just want to keep fixing the wall, or do you want to actually address the foundation of it so that this problem can go away? And it's like, without question. Okay, yes, absolutely, let's do that. So we've got about 15 minutes left. We've talked a lot about the problems and what people are facing and why these are here and how these happen. I'd like to talk a little bit about the intervention. So for parents and families and people out there struggling with these things, really, where do they start? What can they do?
Yeah, and I think that, what I do is I give people a lot of faith, right? So
Yeah.
I think parents and adults and people are a lot more intelligent than we give them credit for, especially now. So I like to talk in reality, right? Because
Right.
we're talking in general terms, and, people talk about brain imbalances and right and left, but it's really a lot more specific what we do, right?
Yes.
And so, when you look at something like OCD or Tourette's, or ADHD, and people will look at it and say, well, all right, you're talking about a right brain delay. But let's be really more specific. What's actually really happening, right? Because before we can really talk about what we can do, you really need to understand. So ultimately, what we said is that this prefrontal area of the brain is the seat of all behavior, right? And there are 5 main areas that are associated with that area. One that controls motor functions or movement of any kind, whether especially complex movement. One that controls eye movements and attention. One area that controls all of our social behavior and some emotional regulation. Others that control our thinking or cognitive or executive functions. Others that control our motivation and some of our get up and go type of thing. And those areas really in some combination control all aspects of human behavior. And so these are literally areas of our brain, right? The premotor area, the frontal eye field, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, the orbital frontal cortex. And the right and left side of them are different. They have different versions of it. And again, the whole brain is working when we're doing things, right? So for instance, let's say we talk about the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex on the left, which is also known as Broca's area, which is where we have expressive language and speech comes from. So we have that area there. On the other side, we have nonverbal language, right? But so when we say, okay, we're using our left brain to speak, the right brain is firing at the same time, but it's basically inhibiting. It's either one part of it is also interpreting the nonverbal communication, because whenever we speak, we're doing both at the same time, right?
Right.
And we're expressing both. But then the other aspect is, let's say we have an area like the orbital frontal cortex, which controls social behavior. So we go out and we want to be social and do something social. The right brain is active, inhibiting all of the inappropriate social things we could do at that same time. They're both working, right? But one is doing something very different. And so the left brain kind of is the active part. It's like kind of like the gas pedal. In these parts of our behavior, it combines these things together at any moment in time to create a behavior, whatever that is, and it puts it out there, and we kind of simulate it, and the right brain then will inhibit all the other behaviors we could be doing at the same time, and then when we're done with this behavior, it shuts that off so that we can move to the next behavior. So think about it that way. So the left brain is about, being able to go out there, and it does what it does, and it likes patterns, and it likes to do the familiar things, and it's goal directed, and it's motor driven, and it's intentional. So the left brain comes up with a plan, an idea, it has a goal, it wants to do something, it combines these different types of behaviors, and it generates it. And the right brain, then before we generate it, we may say, no, that's not going to work, or that's really inappropriate, or we shouldn't really do that. And it stops it before it happens. Or once we do it, then we stop it so that we don't keep on doing it over and over and over, obsessively, compulsively, or generate a vocal noise when we shouldn't. So the right brain kind of stops it either before we do it, or then when we're done, it stops it so we can move on. So what we see is when we're saying ADHD and OCD and tics is a right brain delay, these networks, these specific networks from the prefrontal area to an area called the basal ganglia, they're not really developed, they're immature, they're not really working as well. And the left brain is overactive and it's very strong. So we initiate something and we can't stop it. The right brain isn't there to stop it. And so whether it's hyperactivity or impulsivity or tics or noises or obsessive thoughts or compulsive behaviors or an overactive immune system, this is these imbalances. And when we're going to treat these, it's not just about just stimulating the right brain, right? or just stimulating the brain as a whole, because that's what everybody does and it doesn't work. It's about not only stimulating the right brain, it's about stimulating the specific networks in this brain and all of the different sensory information that is underlying it. But we also have to remove anything that's interfering from this development, because usually what's happened is it hasn't fully developed on the right side and it's overdeveloped on the left. So what we're doing is involve that, plus we said it comes down and it affects the whole body. So we have digestive problems and chronic inflammation and food sensitivities. We have to clear that out really before we can fix the brain, or as we fix the brain. So it's really a lot more complicated than what people think from the surface, but it's very specific what we do, and we understand what to do because our exam identifies all of this, and that's the whole point.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to be able to point out just you being able to describe in one conversation of what a person's doing. Like, I'm using my hands to gesture and to my tone, or how we're using our voice, and all of these things that just happen in just microseconds of just in the brain, and how we take that for granted in terms of all this is that magic of the symphony of our bodies and our nervous system. So you just describing that, I'm like, we can't go in and describe, like, this is happening as I'm talking to you. Like, we don't think about it, but it's automatic that we think. And so much that, you know, even the practice members that we see who have never been exposed to work like this take for granted. And I'm sure a lot of practitioners, we don't think about it. So just you just bringing that up, I just I was like, wow.
I love that analogy of, I've used it in my books for years, but the analogy of that symphony in the brain is that there's this complex symphony going on where the brain is firing off and connection and breaking apart, and different instruments come up and then other instruments. And so the key underlying that is really, you know, when you look at a symphony, what's the key? The key is the conductor, right? The key is what the timing, the thing that brings it all together, and the different tempo that different instruments play at. And, you know, when we look at it and break it down, people may have heard of things like delta waves and theta waves and alpha waves and beta and gamma. And what it means is that, you know, we have different frequency bands. And when we said functionally connected, it means that they may not be physically connected with one another, but they're communicating through the same frequency band. And they talk to one another through that band, and these different bands represent that. And so, you know, it's really even more complex than that, but it's really this beautiful thing that's going on. And now we have tools like QEEG where we can actually look at the brain in real time and see these things and really fine tune it. And, you know, it's like if you have a group of people in one area and they all have walkie-talkies, and you have another group and they all have walkie-talkies, and all the people that have walkie-talkies in their group, they're all tuned to the same frequency band, right? And they can talk to one another, but they're in different frequency bands of the other group, so they can't talk to them. Or maybe they can talk to one group but not the other group. And the idea is to get all of these different groups to be on the same frequency band, and then they can communicate. And that's what we're trying to do. And the reason why they're not on the same frequency band is because these frequency bands are part of a maturational process, meaning that, you know, as we go from, you know, low frequency waves like delta and theta, you know, children start out with low frequency waves. Infants, that's all they have in their brain. They don't have alpha and beta and gamma waves yet. And as the brain grows, it gets faster and faster and faster. And so if the brain is immature, then we see that there aren't, you know, the right amount or the right balance of low frequency and high frequency waves. And so ultimately, you know, what we're trying to do is tune this all together. And I look at us as kind of the maestro of how do we, you know, bring this all together and bring in all these areas and do it so that we can get everything to combine together and integrate it. And in most cases, when we do that, we fix these problems. And that's an important thing too, because most people with things like OCD or Tourette's or tics or ADHD or even some cases of autism are told, oh, you can never fix this problem, and don't even dare say that, you know, that you can actually, you know, do that, but, you know, that maybe you can improve it a little bit, or you can just manage it long term. But, you know, I mean, when you understand the problem and you look at it and there's no pathology and there's no genetic mutation and there's no actual injury in the brain, you look at it and say, why can't this problem be corrected? And if you really want to impact somebody's life, and if you really want to change things, the only way to do that is to really fix the problem, not manage it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the line we also hear a lot from parents that have heard from other providers, you know, we touched on this earlier, was, oh, well, they'll just grow out of it. You know, they have ADHD, it's normal for kids not to be able to pay attention, especially boys, and they'll grow out of it. And you know, we all know here that that's not the case. And letting parents know there are alternatives. Yes, things can be done. Yes, there are interventions that can help, and having other alternatives even besides just medication to manage symptoms.
And just going back earlier where you were just painting a picture of these primitive reflexes that are retained or any imbalance to the brain, these deficits and delays with medication, it really doesn't address the core of the issue, and then down the road it paints a more complex area, multifactorial, different type of issues that continues to pile on as adults that, you know, we oftentimes overlook, and we think it's just one event or one situation, wherein truly there's all this true bigger connection behind it, that if we miss it, we have an opportunity to be able to address. So that's a big deal.
Yeah, well, that's where it comes down to understanding really what the core issue is, and medication never addresses the core issue. And we know that. I mean, you know, it's a way of compensating, and it may help improve symptoms, but it does not ever address a core issue. It never fixes a problem because it's not therapeutic. And, you know, and again, these problems are complex. They involve multiple areas of the brain, multiple systems all the time. So to just try to use one modality to fix a problem that has multiple systems involved isn't going to work. And when you have imbalances in these systems, it's not just randomly stimulating. And again, you have to understand how the body and the motor system and the senses and, you know, how all of this works together. And everybody is an individual. Everybody is unique. There's no, we don't use a cookbook method in any way. We're really individualizing it, even though there are basic, truths that we see. And that's the thing, is that's the fascinating thing about what we do. That's what we love about what we do. And that's why we have to examine people and really see what's going on, because everybody has a different combination. But it's always a combination. It's never one issue, one problem. They may have one diagnosis. You know, a kid comes in with an auditory processing deficit. It's never just an auditory processing deficit, right? Or an adult just has depression. I mean, I just put up a paper today on my, the Malillo Method Facebook page about looking at people with chronic depression and then develop this severe inflammatory bowel disease, and trying to understand, how does that happen? Well, because the depression is a brain issue where we have a decreased activity in the left frontal lobe, overactivity of the right frontal lobe, which then generates negative emotions like fear and sadness, guilt and shame. And that imbalance in the brain that results in that also causes an imbalance in the digestive system and in the immune system, and ultimately affects the gut and produces this chronic, inflammatory bowel system that then they're going to give them steroids for to try to fix. But the problem really is here. If you fix the problem and you fix the depression, that digestive system problem goes away. And this is a thing that, we live in such a specialized medical world. There was one, George Bernard Shaw said, doctors are getting more and more specialized, and each year they know more and more about less and less, and eventually they'll know everything about nothing, right? Because they're all looking at one piece of the body and just the kidney, it's not the way the body works. It's all integrated. It all works together, and especially the brain is what integrates it all together. So you have to look at the whole system.
Right. And to emphasize, you have to look at how the whole system develops. If we can touch on this point one more time. Well, we're coming up the end of the interview, so do we want to go with a quick story?
Yeah. We have a couple minutes. Malila, what's your favorite story? What's made a big impact or imprint for you? I know that your son has really influenced you discovering your path, but working with someone, a story that jumps out to you?
No, there really are so many of them, and I
Yeah.
put a lot of them in my book, Disconnected Kids, and and there's I have stories all the time, but I can just tell you a story that happened really yesterday. So, and this is representative of what happens all the time. I had this parent that had reached out to me, and they had this issue with their child that was developing, and he was just a holy terror. I mean, he was just 4 years old and just so unhappy and so miserable, and they came to New York and they spent time with me, and the child was mostly nonverbal, really spoke. If they did speak, they only spoke in like kind of echolalia, just kind of repeating things. And they came and spent 2 weeks with me, and the child had food sensitivities and eczema and all of these different issues, and obviously it was affecting the parents and their marriage. And it turns out that also one of the parents had also had a severe head injury, and they had been suffering from things. And then we went through their history and found that they looked a lot like this kid when they were younger, right? So it was just affecting everybody. And so they spent 2 weeks with me, and we started working with them. And it was, this seemed like little things, but about somewhere during the treatment one day, the kid turned and went to the parents and said, "Food, food, 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 food." And the parents were like, "Okay." And I said, "What is that?" He kept on doing it. He would stop in the middle and go, "Food, food, food, food." And I'd say, "Did he do that?" And they said, "Well, first of all, he's never said the word food before, but second of all, he's ravenous hungry all of a sudden since we've been in New York here. He just, he's eating like crazy. Normally in the past, we would have to make him eat, and we would have to make him drink. Now all of a sudden, he's hungry all the time, and he's thirsty all the time, and he's telling us about it." And they didn't realize it, and I went, "Okay, that's a really big deal, because that means that now he's actually feeling his body. He never knew when he was hungry. He never felt things. He never knew he was thirsty. This is a basic function. In autism, a lot of it is we lose this connection of our right brain to our body and the basic functions." And then he started having eye contact, and then over the next couple of days, he started sharing his food with his parents, and then he started joking with them, right? And playing with them, and then he started getting sad when they left him, right? Or which none of these things had happened. And this happened in 2 weeks. So they went back, and I just spoke with them yesterday, and they're back about a month, and they said everything changed. He got home, and this was a kid, I think I said he was 4 and a half, I think he was around 6, and he went back home, and his two sisters, they went outside and they jumped on their bike, and he had never been able to ride a bike in his life, like never. And if he tried, he would fall and hurt himself. And he jumped on his bike and started riding with them, like no problem, right? And so now the kid is speaking. He's speaking sentences. He is part of the family. He's, it's an entirely different child. And again, we also started working with the father as well, who also had the head injury and everything. And he's feeling very different. So, that's kind of representative. And I have so many of these stories. Like I said, we work with over 50,000 kids, I think, in brain balance. And I've worked with, thousands and thousands of kids in my own practice. But each one of them is special, and each family story is amazing. And it's something that that's the reward for what we do.
Absolutely, yeah. Restoring the beauty in families.
Yeah.
I mean, like you said, there's just no greater gift in that. Well, Dr. Melito, we want to thank you so much for coming on the show today, spending the hour with us. For our audience out there, how can they connect with you further if they want to learn more about you, more about your work? And also, please tell a little bit about the book that we were talking about prior to the show starting.
Yeah. So, obviously, drrobertmelillo.com is my website, and anybody who wants to work with me in any way can go right through there and contact, my staff. I have a very active practice in New York City. And people can come and see me in the city, and we have different types of programs. Like I said, some people will come for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, some for a week. I also work with a lot of people local in New York, and a lot of my people come internationally, although that's been on hold for now. And so that, I love working with patients, and also we do virtual consults and remote consults. And then I also have a lot of students like you guys, so I like to refer people. We have a referral network that we can refer people around the world that I've trained. I've trained over 10,000 health professionals. A lot of what they can do can be done at home if they read my book, Disconnected Kids, or any of the other books. They can get that through Amazon or through Barnes & Noble or anything that they're out there. And we do have online courses for adults, like an online program for ADHD and other adult issues that they can do it right online in their home that can help them and maybe get rid of their issues. And the most recent book, and we said, I now have 6 best-selling books. And Einstein's Desk is another book. This is my first novel, and it's basically a historical fiction. And it was an interesting story because it started as really a way to try to bond with my son and get him to read when he didn't want to read when he was younger, and by getting him to try to write a book together. And I came up with this story about Einstein and his relationship with Tesla, and most of it is based on, 90% of it is based on real things or real events that happened or probably happened or may have happened, and also a lot of it from my life. And it's something that was a way of educating people to what we do in functional neurology, functional neuroscience, and integrating it with physics and the universe and all these different things. But it's a very fun book. As you said, you read it, Sam, in 2 days, which is a good thing, and we'll be getting very good reviews. But it's also a good way to introduce any adult into, especially people that maybe don't like to read too much or aren't going to read technical issues, and you really want to understand what we do and how we do it. We describe it in that book, but it's done in a way that's really very entertaining and fun, and I think so it's just another way of kind of educating people. All I'm trying to do is raise awareness around the world and train people and bring this work, because what we do is the most sophisticated and most effective, I think, healthcare model in the world. And it can help so many people who are struggling, and we just want to get it out there in any way possible.
Completely agree. Yeah. For those of you out there, definitely check out the book, Einstein's Desk. Like I said, I read it in 2 days. Fantastic story. I mean, just total page turner. Well, we want to thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you learned a ton, as we told you that you would. And we will join you guys again in 2 weeks, and we've got another great show lined up. And Dr. Lynn, close us out with our question.
Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Thank you so much.
Thank you.